Now on the APEC VIP hotline, cutting-edge training for the serious athlete, apecgo.com, from rattleandhumsports.com, the Big 12 insider, Kevin Lonnquist. How you doing, Kevin?
I'm good, Brian. How are you doing?
Doing well. Thank you very much for coming on with us again every week. Want to ask you, first of all, about some things that have happened earlier this week. First of all, let's look at the bowl situation. Northern Illinois comes out of nowhere. We thought Kent State would be the wild card in this thing that would create some bowl chaos, but Northern Illinois ends up getting into a top 16 position. That knocks Oklahoma out of a BCS game. What do you think about that?
Well, you can say that that's the way the system works via the computers. Obviously, with UCLA losing to Stanford, that really impacted this, as well as Nebraska getting thumped by Wisconsin in the Big Ten championship game, and then that really hurt. And then obviously Texas getting beat by Kansas State like it did in Manhattan, which was basically the last game of the year for as far as the regular season was concerned. That I think all those events conspired, if you will, to really put Northern Illinois to sneak in there and grab the spot. And I realize that people are going to say, well, Northern Illinois doesn't have the resume that Oklahoma did. Their only loss was to a 4-8 Iowa team, and they didn't have very impressive wins and so forth. And, I look at it like this. I understand what the argument is. I get it, and I realize that OU's two losses were at home to teams to two very good teams. One is going to the Fiesta, and the other one's playing for the national championship game, But I think too that this is why the system was set up, and this is also why that we have 2 more years of this until we get the playoffs started. And I don't know, I kind of think that this is needless hand-wringing because of the fact that, look, you've got your playoff system coming in a couple of years. You have to there might be some tweaks along the way. But, based on what happened last year when everyone was up in arms about LSU and Alabama playing for the national championship last year, that was really the groundswell to get the playoff movement started, which now we have. And I don't know. Sometimes I think that this is kind of like just who can cry the loudest to make themselves heard, and who's going to pay attention to them. But this is the way the system works. And I know people may not be excited to see Florida State take on Northern Illinois in the Orange Bowl, but but why not Northern Illinois? I mean, they did what they were supposed to do. They were a product of the system. They took advantage of what they were supposed to do. They won all the games they were supposed to. They actually had that lead against Iowa very late in the game before Iowa scored with about 2 minutes to go to win the game. And so they did what they had to do. Now, and so, to knock them, I think, is a little bit ludicrous. To blame the system is also ridiculous, too, because the fact that, it's changing in 2 years anyway. So just sit there and ride it out for the next 2 years. And I'm sorry that OU's not going to collect 18 or 17 or $18 million for the Big 12, which might be the source of where all this belly aching is coming from. Well, but it is what it is.
I'll be honest with you, and again, this is SEC bias, okay? But OU was not even in the top 10 teams, so the only reason they were going to get into a BCS game is because you couldn't have 5 SEC teams in BCS games. So I don't really believe that the OU's got that big a beef to begin with, number one. Number two, I got no problem with Northern Illinois. The thing that I have a problem with is I've been listening for years now to all of these presidents who continue to say we want to protect the bowl games. Well, I guarantee you right now, the people who run the Orange Bowl and the people who run the Sugar Bowl do not feel protected. They feel screwed.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's no way you can convince me, and this is nothing against Northern Illinois, but there's no way you can convince me that the Orange Bowl is happy about having to take a Northern Illinois and the challenge. The only reason that thing's going to sell tickets is because Florida State's in the game. Under normal circumstances, they wouldn't even have a Florida team, and then there'd be a half-full stadium.
Right, and that's true, but here's the caveat to that, is that I was looking around this, and Florida State's is having trouble selling tickets for it. Now, they've had some issues in their past about their fans not traveling. But with this game, now their athletic department has actually come out with a plan to try and sell tickets at half price just so they can get the tickets moving on that.
That's pathetic.
And that is pretty pathetic. But I'm going to say this, too, is that if you don't have Northern Illinois in this process, or like Utah a few years ago, or Boise State playing TCU a couple of years ago, something in the Fiesta Bowl or something along those lines, if the big-time college commissioners and the big-time presidents of these BCS conferences all know that if they didn't include the non-AQ schools, they would have been hit with a huge antitrust lawsuit, and they would have lost. And so that's why you've got this hiccup in the new playoff system that's being created, so that they don't get hit with a lawsuit again, because they know that if they try to make this an absolute monopoly event, which is I know what Nick Saban said a couple weeks ago, saying that there should be 60 or 70 teams to be playing for that. I think it's an absolute outrage. He might be right, but at the same time, we're just showing where the great divide is, and the divide is getting larger with this. But again, if you don't include the conferences like the Mountain West or the Mid-American Conference, or which I guess we can say that we can throw the Big East in there now, that you're going to have a situation where you're going to get hit with lawsuits, and no one wants to go to court because they know they're going to get nailed, and they're going to have a big monetary judgment nailed against them. And then I just don't think the presidents want the headache, and they know they shouldn't do it either.
And then the other thing that irritates me about this thing is, because I do love college football, and bowl week back when I was a kid used to be, the bowl season used to be an exciting time. But when you look at the litany of 6-6 teams with losing records in their conference, I'm looking at, for instance, the Compass Bowl, Ole Miss with a 6-6 record and a 3-5 SEC record against a Pitt team with a 6-6 record and a 3-4 Big East record. I mean, these schools do not belong in bowl games. They did nothing to earn getting an extra game. Purdue in there at 6-6 with a 3-5 Big Ten record. Those games are atrocious.
Sure. I mean, you can go down to you can even look at Minnesota, who went
exactly. Well, I didn't. I was trying not to be personal. Okay.
No, I understand. You can make it personal because I look at them and say that they took advantage of the system, and so they're going to play Tech. But that game. On a side note, that game might actually be pretty interesting because, Tech really stumbled down the stretch too. But I understand what you're saying about the glut of bowl games. It's just, but look at these communities that are throwing these bowl games too. It's a way to jumpstart their economy.
Sure, too. But it's sad when you look at the ball game and you look at the matchups, and then you look at the ball game and you sit down and watch it that night, and the stadium's half full. I mean, it just to me, it just makes college football look bad.
Well. Yeah, and I agree with that. I just think that, too, Brian, that because the fact that, in a lot of neutral site settings, you're not going to get, unless it's like a Texas OU or Florida, Georgia. I mean, really, the neutrals or Army, Navy, you're not going to get that big sellout because you're just not going to get the third-party interest unless you get one of the teams that's going to travel 20 or 30,000 fans, like Ohio State or Wisconsin or Nebraska does. I mean, you're just not going to get your stadium. So that I've even seen in the Capital One Bowl where that's an SEC and a Big Ten team. I've seen where that stadium isn't full either, and you've got two conferences who have fan bases that have traditionally traveled.
Absolutely, you're right.
I just think it's the case too in these bowl games that, and I think these bowl organizers know this too, Brian, from the standpoint that they know they're not going to have full stadiums, so they have to put kind of monetary, realistic expectations of what do we think we can actually garner out of this, and and kind of go from there. And plus the fact that if you're going to be offering, if these bowls are going to be summoning up these types of payouts, then it's foolish for these conferences not to try and get involved in that, because it's obviously going to help their athletic departments and it's going to help the conference in terms of the revenue distribution.
Sure. All right. Another big point this week, I don't know how big it is, but Bill Powers, the president at UT, comes out this week and gives Mac Brown the dreaded vote of confidence. For one thing, I loved what the Big 12 writer in the Dallas Morning News wrote. He says, why? Because nobody was really going after Mac's job. That's pretty much quieted down, so why do it now? And it sounds like it's a recruiting maneuver.
Yeah, it was, and because Texas has really struggled this year from the recruiting standpoint. I mean, the kids that they have about 13 commitments right now, and they're pretty good, but they got hit earlier in the week when they lost a running back here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, running back from Arlington Martin by the name of Kyle Hicks, who switched his verbal commitment from Texas to TCU. So, and there's also some kids, in Texas, admittedly, they're going after a couple of junior college quarterbacks right now because obviously that's an indication that they don't like what they have with Case McCoy or David Ash. And, really they're kind of trading some water right now. And I think just some solidarity from the administration, as odd as the timing might be perceived is probably good from the standpoint to let everybody know that saying, hey, the big guys stepping in and saying, no, we're fine, we're going to stick with what we've got, and we're going to see this through. And again, like we talked about before, like last week, Brian, I mentioned that I thought it would be hard for Mac to come back, but of course, after I hung up with you, I kind of thought, well, it's going to be really hard to get a guy out of there who's not only been successful in his basically in 13 of his 15 years there with bowl game appearances. He's won a national championship. He's played for another. It's going to be hard to get that resume out of there. And I realize that, and also Mac has kind of sold the idea to administration that he thought that they were going to be able to compete for a championship next year. Now, if that doesn't happen next year, then I think you're going to see the move.
Oh,
and
yeah.
So,
yeah.
But I think for now, this was a way to kind of stem the tide, to kind of get the recruiting classes sewed up. They've obviously got a lot of spots to fill. But their recruiting has been a little bit odd because they seem to be trying to go after a lot more kids that have been committed elsewhere. They're in the running for a couple of other kids. There's an offensive lineman down in Katy that they're competing with. That they're in the running with Baylor and UCLA and Oklahoma. And then there's also a defensive tackle up in Waco by the name of Andrew Billings that they're basically fighting out with Texas, with Baylor as well. But it seems like though this is more than usual that Texas will start to kind of sniff around other programs' commitments, which I don't have a problem with. That's the way the game has always been played. Although we kind of transcended into a period where it's kind of like an unwritten rule of recruiting that once a kid is committed to your school that you leave them alone, in which I've never bought that, but that seems to be kind of the way things have been perceived here in the last several years.
Yeah. Now, in your Rattle and Hum Sports column, the Big 12 Extra, you did a lot of end-of-the-year kinds of things. I don't think anybody would have a quarrel with, obviously, Player of the Year Colin Klein. I think that there's no question that Bill Snyder probably deserves Coach of the Year, but that's a much tougher selection just because of the jobs I think that Art Briles and TCU, Gary Patterson, did this year to salvage seasons that look like they were heading into the toilet early.
Yeah, and you could even throw Mike Gundy into the mix at Oklahoma State when he has to win 7 games by using 3 different starting quarterbacks, which is really hard to do. I mean, it's kind of unprecedented to go 7-5, and obviously they were 2 weeks. They were still in the middle of the conference race up until the OU game over the Thanksgiving weekend. But yeah, great job by Gary and his staff to keep this team competitive. And as I've said in that column, and as I've said to other people, that this team is very, very close to competing for a Big 12 championship next year. I think if Trevon Boykin, their quarterback, has a really good offseason of film study, working on his mechanics, decision-making, and so forth, he's got the receiving core there already with Ladarius Brown and Brandon Carter, to name a couple kids, that he can really build some things around. And that running game will probably be just as good as it has been over the last couple of years. They're very, very close. And of course, not to mention Devontae Fields, their very talented defensive end.
Now, let me throw one other question out at you while we're talking about that, though. The wild card, do you let Casey Pahal back on this team?
I don't think he's ever going to step foot on the TCU campus again.
Why not?
For a couple of reasons. I think that just the damage that the persona of the program could be impacted again by him. And number 2, I just think from a locker, and I'm going with my gut on this, but I think from a locker room standpoint, I think the team really rallied around Boykin, and I think that they believe in him, they trust him, they understand that this was his first year to really kind of go through the highs and lows of it. He made some great plays. He scored what would have been the game-time touchdown against OU until it was called back. He led them down the field to tie, to lead to the overtime shootout with Peck. He won in Austin. So he's done enough to build street cred in the locker room and with his teammates. And I just think that with Paul Hall being there, that there's going to be that trust factor. And I think the best thing for both sides, I know TC would love to have him come back, and they said all the right things when when Casey entered the drug treatment program off campus. And so, if everything goes well. But I think just for all parties, it might be good if there is a separation there and that Casey goes down to maybe a Texas State or maybe even a Tarleton State or somebody along those lines to kind of get a fresh start, a new look at life, a new perspective, a new way to play football, if you will, or a different set of things. because he's got the framework to play in the NFL. NFL teams will find him.
Okay.
That's not going to be a problem if he has if he works on the God-given gifts that he has.
Okay, two other things I want to hit on real quick. Heisman Trophy tomorrow night, and then the coaching carousel. First, the Heisman. What do you think happens tomorrow?
I think Johnny Manziel wins it from Texas A&M. He breaks the mold and becomes the first freshman to win it. I think Colin Klein finishes third behind them. Him, Manziel and Manti Te'o of Notre Dame. I think it was a great year, but obviously, sometimes these Heisman Trophy races really come down to how you finish, and the thing that's going to be etched in a lot of people's minds is how Klein really struggled down the stretch, because he was okay against Texas. He wasn't great, but he didn't make a lot of mistakes with the exception of the interception. But the Baylor game was where he threw the 3 interceptions, and Kansas State got drilled. As the number 1 team in the BCS, I think that really hurts him. And so I think that's the way your race is going to finish out tomorrow. And that's fine. I mean, hey, just because the history of the game says that no other freshman has ever won it doesn't mean that should never change. And like we talked about before, if the old fat white voters in the Heisman Trophy race all of a sudden kind of circle the wagons around Notre Dame because Notre Dame's number 1 in the country, and they want to give it to Te'o, which he did win the Maxwell Trophy yesterday, which is kind of interesting because they always say the Maxwell winner is kind of the precursor to the Heisman Trophy winner. So just kind of watch for that. But I still think Manziel's going to win this.
Very good. Okay, and the coaching carousel. First of all, Brett Bielema going to Arkansas. That came just so far out of left field that I'm still trying to get over it.
I am too, but I love it personally.
Oh, it's a great move for him, I think.
I think it's a great move for him. And just to get on a personal note, as a Minnesota fan, watching Wisconsin kick Minnesota for 10 years, I absolutely supported that move. But anyway,
hey, I'm all about that. That's fine.
Exactly. But anyway, but seriously, Brett's done a great job there. I know that he irritated a lot of Wisconsin fans and Big Ten fans about his whine of Urban Meyer's recruiting tactics at Ohio State and that sort of thing. But I think Brett's style of a power running game, and he's actually he actually has mixed in a pretty good passing game there when Russell Wilson was there. I mean, they were pretty good throwing the football. I mean, it's not like Wisconsin is 3 yards in a cloud of dust traditionally. He did a great job with that team. I mean, you don't go to 3 consecutive Rose Bowls. This year, a little bit tainted, if you will, because of the fact that Ohio State and Penn State were on probation and ineligible for the game, for the Big Ten championship game. But nonetheless, he took advantage of it, and when you stick 70 points on Nebraska, who was considered the best eligible team in the conference, I think that says a lot about Brett, and I think his style will play. The key for Brett will be if he can build a coaching staff that's going to have South and Texas ties, because Arkansas already had enough problems recruiting into Texas, and now with Texas A&M's emergence in the SEC and putting together these great classes, the one thing that Arkansas doesn't need to have happen is get him completely cut off from this stage. Right.
Okay, and one last question, because it involved Mike Gundy at Oklahoma State, and he was talking to Tennessee for a second there, it sounded like. Did you ever really believe that Mike Gundy would actually leave Oklahoma State?
I thought it was 50-50. I mean, the amount of FaceTime and the amount of, if you will, public or being as brazen, if you will, with flirting with both the Arkansas and Tennessee jobs. And look, on Tuesday, it was even being reported that Gundy had accepted the Arkansas job until it was completely refuted, within a couple of hours. The issues that Mike is having right now, and he has downplayed it since then, but the issues that he's having right now with Mike Holder, the athletic director, because of decisions on how the non-conference schedule is made up versus and other things that need to be done in the football program. I don't think there's any question that there's some risk between those two sides, and they need to get them worked out. Was Mike on a power play to say, I'm going to leave if you don't do what I want you to? I think there's absolutely a part of that in play here, although what they say behind closed doors should stay behind closed doors. But I think this was a way of Mike to say, I'm going to go, and he probably would have accepted accepted the Tennessee job if Holder didn't back off. Again, this is all speculative on my part, Brian, but I have to think that there had to be some discussions between those two while this was going on earlier this week before something was solved. Now we'll see moving forward after the bowl game and in the off season, what kind of peace there actually is in Stillwater.
Good stuff. Kevin, great to talk to you again, as always. I wish we could do it for a solid hour. I'm sure we could fill it up pretty easily.
No problem, Brian.
Hey, have a great day. Thank you very much. Kevin Lonnquist from RattleandHumSports.com on Brian Houston Sports Radio Live, 99.3 Talk FM.